In the quiet, snow-covered countryside, the early morning hours brought a bitter chill, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of a brutal storm. The air was still, save for the soft crunch of snow beneath boots, as the Johnson family went about their morning routine. The father, John, was in the barn, checking on the animals, while his wife, Sarah, prepared breakfast in the warm glow of their kitchen. Their children, Lucy and Ben, helped their mother with chores, excited for the day ahead. The peaceful, rural life they had chosen was all they knew. But everything changed when a faint whimper echoed from the porch. At first, John thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but when the sound came again, this time unmistakable and full of pain, he knew something was wrong. As he opened the door, he was met with an unexpected sight. A small fox, shivering in the snow, her fur matted and eyes filled with desperation. There was no sign of aggression or fear in her gaze, only a quiet plea for help. Little did the family know, this simple act of kindness would lead them on a journey they could never have imagined. The fox, and her hidden pain, would teach them all the true meaning of compassion, leaving them forever changed. The sound echoed through the stillness, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was a cry, a soft, desperate whimper that cut through the cold morning air. John stepped out onto the porch, the crunch of the snow beneath his boots almost deafening in the quiet. He paused, his breath misting in the air, straining to hear above the howling wind. At first he thought it might be an animal in the woods, perhaps a dog or a stray, but something about the sound made him hesitate. There was a certain urgency to it, a vulnerability that struck him deep. He leaned closer to the door, his heart pounding as the cry came again, louder and more distinct now. It wasn't like anything he'd heard before. This was a cry for help, raw and filled with pain. Turning to Sarah, who was still inside, he called out to her. "Something's out here," he said, his voice low, full of concern. She quickly joined him, her face pale, her worry mirrored in his eyes. As they stepped out onto the porch, the source of the cry finally revealed itself. Huddled in the corner, covered in snow and clearly exhausted, was a small fox. Its fur was matted with ice, its body trembling with every breath. The fox's eyes met John's, wide, desperate, and filled with a quiet trust that pierced his heart. It was clear from the way the fox was holding itself that it was no ordinary animal. It was in distress, its every movement a silent plea for help. For a moment, John stood frozen, unsure of what to do. He had always kept a safe distance from the wildlife around their farm, never interfering, believing that nature should take its course. But this was different. The fox wasn't just looking for food or shelter, it was looking for survival, and it had nowhere else to turn. The fox made a feeble attempt to stand but collapsed, too weak to move. John's chest tightened as he watched it struggle. Sarah, standing beside him, knelt down and reached out a hand. "We can't just leave her out here," she whispered, her voice filled with concern. John knew she was right. The fox was in pain. A wound on its side suggested it had been through a battle, that possibly with a predator or just the harshness of the cold. The cry had been its only way of reaching out, seeking refuge. With a deep breath, John made his decision. He gently lifted the fox, careful not to hurt it further, and whispered, "Let's get you inside." The fox's eyes flickered with a mix of trust and uncertainty as he carried her into the house, her frail body barely moving in his arms. As they stepped inside, the warmth of the house enveloped the fox, and for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, she let out a small, relieved sigh. The desperate cry that had echoed through the cold night had led them here, to this moment of kindness. And with it, the family unknowingly embarked on a journey that would forever change their lives. Inside the warmth of the farmhouse, John gently placed the fox down near the hearth, where the fire crackled and popped, its warm glow casting soft shadows across the room. The family gathered around her, unsure of what to do next, but instinctively knowing they had to help. Sarah, her face filled with concern, knelt beside the fox, reaching out slowly to stroke her matted fur. The fox flinched at first, but then seemed to relax slightly under Sarah's touch. Her eyes were filled with pain, exhaustion, and a deep, silent plea for help. Yet there was something else in those eyes too, something softer, a quiet trust that the family had not yet fully earned. John stood back for a moment, his eyes scanning the fox's battered body. Her side was raw and bleeding, a wound that looked like it had been caused by a sharp claw or a predator's bite. She was thin, her body trembling not just from the cold but from sheer exhaustion. The snow had covered her fur, and her breathing was shallow. Every small movement she made was labored, as though the weight of the storm, the wound, and her survival had taken everything from her. John couldn't bear to see her in such a state. The children, Lucy and Ben, stood silently in the doorway, their eyes wide with concern. The older sister, Lucy, stepped forward first, her young hands shaking slightly as she reached out to the fox. "Is she okay, Daddy?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with worry. John gave her a soft smile, trying to reassure her. "I'm not sure, sweetheart," he said, "but we're going to help her, okay?" Ben, still standing a little further back, looked at the fox with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. "Do you think she has babies?" he asked, his voice soft with wonder. The thought of a family of foxes tugged at John's heart. Could this little one be a mother too? Where were her cubs? What had happened to her in the wild? John's mind raced as he kneeled beside Sarah, who was now gently dabbing the fox's wound with a cloth. The family worked together in quiet coordination, wrapping the fox's wound as best as they could and offering her water in small amounts. The fox drank eagerly, her trembling body still showing signs of weakness. But there was something in her eyes, something that said she was starting to trust them. As the family worked to make her comfortable, John glanced at Sarah, his mind filled with questions. How had the fox ended up in such a state? Was she alone? Had something happened to her family? The storm outside raged on, a reminder of the harsh world the fox had been forced to navigate. It became clear that this wasn't just a rescue from the cold, it was a rescue from something deeper. A survival story in which the family played an unexpected role. "We'll need to keep her here until she's stronger," Sarah said quietly, looking up at John. Her words were a promise of safety, of shelter. But John knew that the real test had just begun. The fox had entered their lives out of sheer necessity, but would she be able to survive? And more importantly, where were her cubs? In the quiet of the moment, as the storm howled outside, the family knew they had made the right decision. They had opened their door to a creature in need, and in doing so, had unknowingly set the stage for a journey that would change them all. The fox rested on the soft bedding the family had prepared for her. Her body, though still frail, seemed to be soaking in the warmth of the fire and the kindness that surrounded her. Her breathing had become a little steadier, though she still trembled slightly. But as the family sat together, silently watching her, they couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. They weren't just helping a fox. They were connecting with the raw power of compassion, the same compassion that had brought this fragile creature to their doorstep. And as the fox closed her eyes, finally finding some rest, the family knew that they had done something good, not just for the animal, but for themselves as well. The warmth of the fire enveloped the fox, a stark contrast to the biting cold she had endured outside. As Sarah continued to tend to her, she noticed a small sigh escape the fox, a sound that was almost imperceptible but filled with the weight of relief. The small creature, once shivering violently in the snow, was now beginning to relax. Her fur no longer frozen and matted, but starting to soften in the warmth of the hearth. The family's house, though modest, felt like a sanctuary now. A safe haven not just from the storm, but from the dangers of the wild. John stepped back, watching Sarah gently clean the fox's wounds. He couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and concern. The fox had been through so much already. Who knew how long she'd been out there in the storm, struggling to survive? Every scrape and bruise told a story of perseverance, of a creature who had fought against nature's harshest elements in a desperate bid to protect herself and perhaps her young. The thought of her cubs, if she had any, was never far from John's mind. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Lucy asked, her voice soft as she sat by the window, watching the snow still falling heavily outside. Her eyes were filled with worry, but also a quiet hope. She had always loved animals, and the sight of the fox curled up by the fire touched her heart deeply. "I hope so, sweetheart," John replied, kneeling beside her. "She's a tough one, but we've got to keep an eye on her." Meanwhile, Ben, his little face full of wonder and concern, asked, "Do you think she's been through this before? Or is she new to this area?" John looked at his son thoughtfully, unsure of the answer. "We can't be sure, but she's been through a lot. She's not just cold, she's been hurt. Something's happened to her, and I think her struggle is far from over." Inside the warmth of the house, the family worked together to ensure the fox had everything she needed. Sarah continued to gently pet the fox, her soothing touch a quiet comfort to the frightened creature. Every so often, the fox would blink up at her, as though acknowledging her care and slowly trusting the family more. Sarah moved around the kitchen, preparing a small dish of warm broth and mashed potatoes for the fox. She wasn't sure what kind of food was best, but the warmth and nutrients from a simple meal could help the fox recover from the stress and trauma she had endured. The family's house, though small, was filled with love and a deep sense of responsibility toward the creatures that crossed their path. It was this love, this willingness to help, that had led them to open their door to the fox in the first place. As the evening passed, the fox's breathing grew steadier. The tension in her body began to ease as she licked her wounds, instinctively cleaning herself. She was exhausted, but there was a glimmer of life in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Her fur had dried, and her body was beginning to warm up. The family gathered around the fireplace, watching in silence as the fox rested. The children, still concerned, didn't leave her side. Lucy sat closest, quietly whispering to the fox, as though trying to comfort her. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're safe now." Ben, his young face filled with curiosity, asked, "Do you think she'll stay with us?" He was imagining the fox as a permanent guest in their home, and while the thought was endearing, John knew the reality would be more complicated. "Maybe," John said softly, "but the wild is never far from home. We'll do our best to help her, but if she's able, she'll go back when the time is right." The night grew late, and the storm outside began to subside. The howling wind that had rattled the windows all evening faded into a steady, quiet snowfall. Inside the house, however, the warmth and comfort were palpable. The fox, once so frail and fragile, now seemed to settle in, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but filled with trust. For the first time since she'd appeared on their doorstep, there was peace. The family, silently gathered in the warmth, understood something profound that night: the simple, yet extraordinary power of kindness. In the quiet of that room, surrounded by the fire's soft glow, they shared an unspoken bond with the wild creature that had sought their help. And as they watched her sleep, they knew that in some way, their lives had been forever changed by the fox who had appeared at their door. As the hours passed, the warmth of the fire seemed to have done its work, at least on the surface. The fox's body had relaxed, her shivering reduced to a soft tremble, and her eyes no longer seemed frantic. She lay still, her breathing steadying as she nuzzled deeper into the blankets the family had prepared for her. For all appearances, she looked like she was finally starting to heal. But something wasn't quite right. John and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances as they watched the fox. There was a subtle tension in the air, something they couldn't ignore. Every so often, the fox would lift her head, her ears twitching at an unseen sound, her eyes darting around the room with a look of quiet panic. She would then lie back down, but the unease never left her. It was as though she was waiting for something, or someone. Her eyes would suddenly flicker towards the door, her body stiffening, only to relax again when she saw that nothing was coming. Sarah moved closer to the fox, gently running her hand down her fur. But even her touch didn't seem to calm the fox entirely. The animal's restlessness was undeniable. "She's still scared," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with concern. "She's not used to being safe, not after everything she's been through." John nodded. He could see it too. The fox had been through something far beyond a simple struggle for survival. This wasn't just about the storm or the cold. There was something deeper haunting her. The fear in her eyes wasn't just from the weather. It was from the unknown, from whatever had caused her to run in the first place. Suddenly, the fox let out a low, guttural whimper. It was a sound that made the hair on the back of John's neck stand on end, a deep, mournful cry. She tucked her head beneath her paws, but her body was still tense, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. It wasn't the cry of pain, but one of desperation, as though something or someone was still threatening her. Her trembling body and nervous energy filled the room with an unease that no warmth could completely erase. "She's been through more than we thought," John murmured, his face hardening with concern. "She's not just hurt. She's been through trauma, real trauma." As the family quietly observed her, the realization set in. The fox might be physically safe for now, but her journey was far from over. The emotional scars she carried were just as deep as the wounds on her body. And for the family, the next challenge would be not just healing the fox's injuries, but helping her find a sense of peace, something she had lost long before the storm arrived at their doorstep. As the hours turned into the night, an unsettling thought lingered in John's mind. The fox, despite being injured and exhausted, had made it to their doorstep. But where were her cubs? The bond between a mother and her young was undeniable, and John couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The way she had looked around the room, the sudden, desperate whimpers, he knew she was missing something, or someone. "Sarah, I think we need to find her cubs," John said, his voice low but filled with urgency. Sarah, who had been tending to the fox all evening, stopped in her tracks, her heart sinking. She hadn't considered it yet. Her focus had been entirely on helping the fox recover. But now, seeing her motherly distress, it all made sense. John stood up, his face set in determination. "I can't just sit here knowing they're out there. If she's been running from something, we need to bring them back." Without waiting for an answer, he grabbed his jacket and turned to his son, Ben. "Grab the flashlight, Ben. We're going out to look for them." Ben, who had been watching the fox all evening with a sense of quiet concern, nodded. "I'll help, Dad," he said, already grabbing his boots and coat. Together they stepped outside into the cold night, the air biting at their skin. The storm had passed, leaving a deep blanket of snow that stretched out in every direction, the woods now silent except for the sound of their boots crunching through the snow. John and Ben moved carefully, scanning the ground for signs, paw prints, anything that might lead them to the cubs. "Look here," Ben said, pointing to a faint trail in the snow. It wasn't much, just a few marks, barely visible in the moonlight, but it was enough. John's heart raced as they followed the trail deeper into the woods, both of them driven by a shared sense of urgency and concern for the fox family. But as they ventured further into the forest, a sinking feeling settled in John's stomach. The tracks grew fainter and less frequent, as though the fox had been forced to leave the cubs behind or had been separated in some way. There was no sign of them anywhere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they came across a small thicket of trees, and there, huddled beneath a cluster of branches, were two tiny fox cubs, weak, hungry, and shivering in the cold. John knelt down, carefully picking them up one by one. They were too small to walk much longer in the deep snow, their little bodies barely able to move. With the cubs safely in his arms, John gave Ben a look that said everything. They had to hurry. As they turned back toward the house, the cold wind stinging their faces, John's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. The cubs were alive, just barely, but alive. And with them safely in tow, they would bring the family back together. As John and Ben returned to the house, the door creaked open, and the fox, sensing the presence of her cubs, lifted her head in an instant. Her eyes locked onto the two tiny figures in John's arms, and in that moment, everything seemed to stop. The weight of the storm, the injuries, the fear, none of it mattered. The bond between mother and cubs was undeniable. With a soft whimper, the fox slowly pushed herself to her feet, her body still weak, but driven by a mother's instinct. She shuffled over to the cubs, her eyes brimming with both relief and exhaustion. As John placed them gently on the ground, the mother fox rushed forward, her trembling body reaching out to nuzzle her cubs, her nose pressing into their fur as if reassuring them they were safe. For a few moments, the world outside ceased to exist. The fox family was reunited, each of them now safe, surrounded by warmth and care. The cubs, still weak, nestled closer to their mother, who, despite her own pain, wrapped them in the protection only a mother could give. John and Ben stood in the doorway, watching in silence as the fox family shared their quiet, powerful moment. The tears that filled Sarah's eyes as she looked on were not just from the relief of seeing them together again, but from the deep realization that their simple act of kindness had brought healing. Not only to the fox, but to themselves as well. As the dawn broke and the storm finally ceased, the fox family stirred, their once exhausted bodies now rejuvenated by the warmth and safety the family had provided. The mother fox stood up, her movements slow but purposeful as she nudged her cubs to their feet. They were no longer shivering, no longer weak. Together, they had found strength once again. John, standing by the door, watched them with a quiet sense of fulfillment. He knew it was time for them to leave. The wild was calling them back, and while part of him wished they could stay, he understood that the fox family belonged in the woods. The connection they had shared was fleeting, but profound. They had come to his doorstep out of desperation, but now they were leaving strong and united. As the dawn broke and the storm finally ceased, the fox family stirred, their once exhausted bodies now rejuvenated by the warmth and safety the family had provided. The mother fox stood up, her movements slow but purposeful, as she nudged her cubs to their feet. They were no longer shivering, no longer weak. Together, they had found strength once again. John, standing by the door, watched them with a quiet sense of fulfillment. He knew it was time for them to leave. The wild was calling them back, and while part of him wished they could stay, he understood that the fox family belonged in the woods. The connection they had shared was fleeting but profound. They had come to his doorstep out of desperation, but now they were leaving strong and united. As the fox family disappeared into the woods, the house fell silent, the warmth of the fire now a soft memory against the chill of the morning. John, Sarah, and the children stood together, watching the empty landscape, knowing that they had shared something extraordinary. The bond they had formed with these wild creatures wasn't just about survival. It was a lesson in kindness, compassion, and the power of connection. "We did the right thing," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with quiet reflection. John nodded, his eyes fixed on the woods where the fox family had vanished. "We gave them a chance," he said, his voice steady. "And in return, they gave us something we'll never forget." The family had opened their door to a stranger in need, and in doing so had found something deeper. A reminder that no matter how wild or distant the world may seem, kindness has the power to bring us all together. As the sun rose higher, casting light on the snow-covered landscape, they knew that this moment would stay with them forever. If this story touched your heart, be sure to subscribe for more incredible moments that show how the smallest acts of kindness can change lives. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can give is simply a chance to survive and a place to call home.